People are starting to recognise that what's happening now is not working. People are calling for change. Why is it that somebody like me, somebody like your viewers, are out there working hard, slaving away, paying 20, 30, 40, 50% tax, and yet a billionaire is inheriting 10 billion and paying nothing? You know, this is an absurd system.
And then obviously I got this job as a trader for Citibank. The more money I made, the more I kind of lost my mind.
I'm not trying to redistribute wealth away from the rich. I am trying to stop the redistribution that is bankrupting ordinary people. The worst thing that the rich ever did to the poor was not to take our houses and was not to take our money. It was to make us as selfish as they are.
Gary, one of the biggest episodes on the Diary of a CEO this year has been your episode with Daniel Priestley.
I'm sick of multimillionaires telling kids who can't afford to turn the heating on, you just need to be more entrepreneurial. It's sick, Dan, it's sick. If we're on the Titanic and Daniel Priestley is like an excellent cold water swimmer, maybe he doesn't care that we're going to hit the iceberg, but what about everybody else?
Maybe, I'm sitting here in the immediate aftermath of this, and maybe in 2-3 weeks' time things look calmer. I'm going to take a bit of time off soon because I'm knackered.
Gary, you've had a little bit of a break and you're now back and you're pumping out the content. I'd love to know, just to start us off, with all of the terrible news and everything that's floating around that we're seeing in the headlines from a macro level, how do you feel about the world?
The situation is not good. The situation is not good. So anybody who knows the work that I do, I look a lot at inequality and specifically the wealth distribution. And since the beginning of COVID, there's been a massive increase in inequality. Total amount of money given out by Western governments is absolutely enormous. That money's been accumulated by the rich. And they're using that money to buy assets. And that's pushing the price of assets up. The big thing we're seeing is governments have lost enormous amount of wealth. That wealth has been accumulated by super rich people. And really, here in the UK, you're kind of seeing the welfare state being slowly shut down by a government which is supposed to be a left-wing government. You might imagine they're going to spend more. But really, the same thing is happening all over the world, right? You're seeing this enormous rise in the power and wealth of the billionaires, of the 0.1%. They're using that to rapidly suck out all of the resources, accumulate the resources. The middle class is phenomenally weak. Governments are phenomenally weak. So that's the positive stuff over. The situation is bad, but I think what you are seeing, if you want to look at the bright side of things, is people are starting to recognise that what's happening now is not working. People are calling for change. There's been an unbelievable growth in popularity of my channel and my message, this understanding that inequality is a problem, this understanding we need to move to a fairer tax system. But obviously the flip side of that is it's not just me and my lot that are gaining in popularity. You're also seeing a massive increase in popularity of the far right. As the rich get richer and richer and richer, it becomes easier and easier and easier for them to accumulate the rest of the wealth because they have this massive passive income. Unless we do something about that, that will continue. But I think the demand for doing something is growing and growing.
So can you explain that to us? How is that happening? For those who don't understand how the rich are getting richer and the middle class is getting squeezed, how is that actually happening?
Yeah, I think COVID is the best example of this, really. But to be honest, the 2008 crisis is quite similar in the way that it was managed. So in COVID, the total UK government deficit at the beginning of the COVID is £1 trillion, which is £20,000 for every adult in the United Kingdom. I'm sure the Australian number will be something similar. So we knew at the beginning of COVID that governments were going to give this enormous amount of money out. And we should have had a discussion at the time of where will that money go? Where will that money end up? But we didn't have that discussion. If you follow the money through the system, you can see how the money was accumulated, right? So there's a kind of an assumption that money was accumulated by, for example, furloughed workers. But if you look at the situation of furloughed workers, they didn't get richer during COVID because that money was simply replacing their wages. So I followed it through the system to try to understand where the money actually ended up. So the reason the furloughed workers didn't get richer is because they lost their wages. So if you look at the companies that used to pay the wages, they also didn't get richer because they were shut down. So who accumulated money during COVID? It's the people who used to use the companies that were shut down during COVID, which is basically rich people, because the essential economy stayed open and the non-essential economy shut down. So if you look at my parents who are quite poor, their expenditure is largely rent, mortgage, food, bills. Essential expenditures didn't reduce during COVID. People who have very large non-essential expenditure, rich people, basically didn't spend money. So what you have is government pumps money to ordinary people. They use that to pay their rent, mortgage, food, bills. It goes to the owners of the properties, owners of the debt, owners of the corporations. and they couldn't spend their money during COVID. So what you saw was this massive transfer of money from the government to the rich during COVID. And then after that, you see really clearly what the negative consequences of that are for ordinary people, which is they don't just sit on the money. If you give rich people a ton of money, they use that money to buy existing assets. You see this massive increase in asset prices, and that is rich families outcompeting the middle class, outcompeting the government for ownership of assets. I'm calling it the squeeze out. As the rich get richer and richer and richer, the middle class gets squeezed out. The working class, to be honest, was squeezed out long ago, and the government gets squeezed out. So what you have is these rich people with enormous amounts of passive income making 5, 6, 7% a year in economies which are only growing 1, 2, 3% a year. Their wealths are growing faster than the economy. They're squeezing everybody else out. And basically what you're seeing is the loss of the middle class. And I think in Australia, you're lucky you exist in a country which has an enormous amount of wealth to be squeezed out. There is still some wealth holding by the middle class. But what you're seeing here in Europe, especially here in the UK, is basically the middle class is disappearing. And you're ending up with these kind of extremely unequal societies. And the end point of that is what you see in places like Brazil or places like India, where you have basically a tiny super rich elite, nobody else to own anything. And the end result is broad poverty, unfortunately.
Well, Gary, we're seeing here in Australia a lot of the big corporations blow out a lot of staff at the moment. We're seeing, redundancies. That's happening at a rate that I don't think I've ever seen before. So do you see that stopping, or is that just going to keep going now over the next 3, 4, 5 years?
So in Australia, is that being driven by like low consumer demand, or is there a kind of AI element to this, would you say?
Yeah, I'd say AI is one of the number one reasons why a lot of jobs are getting cut right now.
Yeah, so I think AI is a big part of it. AI, I think it's pretty clear, is going to increase this problem of growing inequality because it's going to decrease the need of the rich for human workers. But also, as the middle gets squeezed out, traditionally, for the last 70 years, this wealth-holding middle class has been the driving engine for like consumption demand, for economic demand in the economy. And as this middle class is being squeezed further and further and further and further, they don't have much spare money to spend. And that filters through the economy, basically. And what you end up with is this very concentrated demand where the rich have an enormous amount of money. But, if I give 20 grand to an ordinary person on the street, they're going to spend 10, 15, and maybe they'll save 5. If I give 20 grand to a very rich person, they're going to use all of that to buy assets. I come from a poor background, but I'm rich now. If you give me 20 grand, it's not going to change my consumption behaviors at all. I'm going to use all of that money to buy assets, and it's going to push asset prices up. So, it filters through the economy. I think it's worth recognizing, the last 70 years are not normal. Here in the UK, especially there in Australia, you've had this wealth holding, high living standards, middle class. But if you look at the history of Europe before the Second World War, that was not normal. If you do not have a middle class that can spend money, then you are not going to have a thriving economy. It's as simple as that. If you want to have an economy which provides a large number of good jobs, you need to have a middle class that can afford to go to the theatre and go to the football and go on holiday, because that is what creates the jobs, basically. So, it's not just about protecting the middle class. It's about protecting an economy that works, essentially.
Yeah. Gary, you speak a lot about taxing the rich. Can you explain what you mean by that? Are these people who are on high-paid jobs, or how rich are the people we need to be taxing?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because I think often when I say tax the rich, what I mean is quite mischaracterized. Obviously, from the perspective of an ordinary person, when I was a kid, I saw the rich as somebody with a good job. When I was a kid, I thought if you made 60 grand a year, that was rich, basically. But, bankers, lawyers, doctors, people often think I'm talking about them. I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about them. When I say tax the rich, I'm talking about phenomenally wealthy families that own enormous amounts of assets, and they don't make their money from their work. They make their money from the assets they own. And I think people don't realize, when we talk about a billionaire, first of all, people don't realize how rich a billionaire is. If you own $1 billion of Australian assets, you are going to make every year $50 million passive income. That's $1 million a week. It's a crazy amount. This is not for their work. This is just, they get out of bed on the Monday, there's $1 million. That's because you own the mining companies or whatever. If you are earning £1 million a week passive income, how much would you spend?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't think you'd even get through it. You wouldn't.
I'd struggle to get through 20k.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be difficult, basically, and that is what they do. If I was making £1 million a week passive income, yeah, maybe I'd spend 20 grand a week, live like the Queen. I'd figure out some way of doing it. And the rest of the money just gets used to buy assets, basically. So if you do not do something about the phenomenally large passive income of these extremely rich people, they basically have no choice but to buy up the rest of the assets. And that means they're outcompeting your government that wants assets to provide healthcare and education. That means they're outcompeting your kids that want houses to raise families in. I think people sometimes think they kind of see me as this like classic left-wing guy. Oh, you want to tax me, you want to tax my kids, you want to tax high earners. I'm trying to protect your wealth from the billionaires. If you do not protect it, you are going to lose it. And, Australia is a very fortunate country. It has this enormous amount of natural wealth. It's not a very densely populated country. Australia could have phenomenally high living standards. Last month I was in Norway, and here is a country that had a different model about what it does with its natural wealth, which is like, look, this is the natural wealth of the country. It belongs to the Norwegian people. Yes, we are going to sell it, but we are going to protect the wealth that we generate from that for the Norwegian government, for the Norwegian people. And now Norway, whilst it does have growing inequality, is able to provide this phenomenally high standard of living. I think what we're seeing in Australia, I love Australia. I've been there a number of times. I've got a lot of Australian friends. The economic management is phenomenally unwise. You can look at these countries in Africa that have enormous natural resource wealth, and they combine that with unbelievably huge levels of poverty for ordinary people. Australia has a choice. Do you want to be Norway, or do you want to be the Democratic Republic of Congo? And that is a question about who owns your wealth, the people of Australia or the billionaires. If you do not tax the billionaires, that will be your answer.
So then how do we tax them? Where do we even begin?
Well, I talk about wealth taxes. So wealth tax is a tax on how much wealth you own. But I think we need to be practical. It's not easy to tax them. Wealth tax is not easy to implement. I think we should be looking at inheritance taxes on very large fortunes. Why is it that somebody like me, somebody like your viewers, are out there working hard, slaving away, paying 20, 30, 40, 50% tax to make whatever, 70 grand, 100 grand a year, and yet a billionaire is inheriting 10 billion and paying nothing? This is an absurd system. Why are hard-working Australian families, in many cases, struggling to pay the bills, paying 40, 50%, and billionaires are paying nothing? It's absurd. It's indefensible. It leads to an outcome of unbelievably high inequality and falling living standards. So, yeah, there's two parts to it, really. The first thing is the question you ask, how do you tax them? And that's a technical question of implementation. The second thing is we need to get this on the political agenda. Because, I've been fighting hard for years here, and finally we're in a situation where British politicians have to face this question every day. And I think if we keep growing at the rate we are going, I think we will force some level of taxation from British governments. But that is only because of the hard work I've done over the years getting this onto the agenda. You are talking to me from Australia, you will be very aware that there is billionaire influence on the media, and those billionaires don't want to pay higher taxes. So really, I see it always as a two-part strategy, which is number one, we need a really clear understanding from ordinary working people here in Europe, there in Australia, that if we do not take action on this gets worse. But number two, when we get the public support, then we need a good implementation that correctly captures the billionaires. But unfortunately, you need to win the comms battle as well as the implementation battle. We're not going to win it this year. We're not going to win it next year. But I think we can win it eventually.
Gary, there's something that I love in this world that we're in right now with digital creators, people like yourself who have your own media companies now. You can speak freely, you can speak your mind. I saw a short video of you recently where you were speaking about how some of these traditional media platforms were starting to pick you up, the BBC, The Guardian. Do you still see them as power players, or do you see now what you're doing as the power?
I think it's really obvious that we are in a transition period where the power is transitioning away from traditional media and towards social media. I think that's been obvious for a while in terms of power in politics. But at the same time, traditional media is still phenomenally powerful. It's losing power, but it is still phenomenally powerful. I could see the gap in social media, and I've been shooting for that gap. But my strategy for the last few years was to write this book. So for those who don't know, I wrote this book called The Trading Game. It was number 1 for 11 weeks this year here in the UK, super popular. And I knew if I wrote a really good book, it was picked up by Penguin Books, they're going to give me a really good press campaign. And they get me on BBC Radio, they get me on TV. But to be honest, even when we were talking about a press campaign, I said to them, what I think you need to get me on, really more than anything, is good long form online podcasts where we can really discuss. Because the truth is, like, I go on BBC and I go on TV. I was on like breakfast TV earlier, like last week. But you're on for 5 minutes, you're on for 10 minutes. It's like bam, 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 bam. There's not really any time to actually explain what's really happening in a way that's clear and understandable. So really, I mean, the truth is, like, I get more views now on my YouTube than any politics show in the UK. And I think the gap is there, and I think the opportunity is really there. But I leverage what I can. I leverage what I can. I leverage print media. I leverage TV. But I think things are changing. The power is online. I think I have a massive advantage that I've come in early. But the truth is, the big guys who accumulated a lot of power is this US far right, is this US alt-right, because they were the first guys to move into that space. But I think there's so much political power to be taken talking about politics, talking about economics online. I think that is really the growing space.
I think the other thing, and you would notice this when you go on those morning TV shows, you're sitting in a space and there's auto cues and everything's written and very well produced. This conversation that we're having now, this knowledge is just coming straight out of your mind and it's very authentic. And I think audiences can feel that. They can watch your YouTube channel and they can feel that is coming from somewhere inside you, and it's not necessarily scripted by a producer or someone else behind you that's making you say certain things. And I think that's also that authenticity that you get in a podcast environment also comes across really clearly and through the vision and through the audio as well.
Yeah, I think that you can't buy honesty and authenticity, can you? I mean, and I'm really, really lucky. Yeah, exactly as you say, nobody influences what I say. Like, it is up to me. I can say very clearly and very honestly whatever I believe and whatever I think. But at the same time, there are a lot of guys out there that intentionally mislead people online. But this is the future of politics. People might not believe this. I'm quite an introverted person. I didn't really want to like make a big YouTube channel with my face on it, with my name on it, which is what I obviously have done. But I could see it's where the power was. And I think, authenticity, honesty, clarity. I think slowness, the ability to just take something, explain it slowly. I don't think the mainstream media is really providing that space. I think it's really exciting. But, at the same time, it's a big part of the reason for the growth in the far right and the growth in people like Andrew Tate, this kind of thing. So it's, I like to think I'm a good actor, but there are a lot of people in the space who I think are perhaps don't have the best intentions.
So how long do you think it's going to take you?
To change, save the global economy?
Yeah.
You know what? I was away for a couple of months. I come back. It's quite like mind-blowing, even to me, what an effect we have had on the political conversation here in the UK. It's honestly like, I've kind of got my hands on my head all the time. Like it's not just me, there's great other people who push this as well, but we're the biggest voice in this, and it's crazy how much you've pushed it into the spotlight, into the conversation. And I think another reason, not just because of the growth of social media, another reason why we have such a huge opportunity is because the economic situation is worsening so quickly. And for that reason, there's this aggressive and really justified loss of faith in traditional politicians. So it creates this kind of power vacuum, really, this vacuum of ideas, which we can move into. For a long time, I did the work I did, not because I thought we would win or even that we could win, but because I felt it was the right thing to do. But in the last couple of months since I've been back, I honestly think that we can win the battle of ideas here on the need for a fairer tax system. But then, of course, once you're in the battle of ideas, that's only the first battle to win. Actually implementing a well-designed tax in itself will be hard. And I think something I do a lot of now, which maybe people don't realize, is I'm constantly on the phone, in calls, in meetings with economists, with think tanks, with academics about, listen, how do we design this tax system? Because the truth is now, I think we will win this argument. And the truth, I actually don't think the competition is the traditional political parties. I think the competition is the far right. Because I think Australia is a bit behind in this, because I think Australia does have, to be honest, I think some of the best living standards in the world at the middle. And that has meant the growth in discontentment has been slower. But I know living standards are falling. I know things like housing is becoming more and more expensive. As living standards continue to fall under the traditional centre parties, there will be increasing demand for something new. And to be honest, I see the competition as between myself and people like me and the far right, people like Donald Trump, people like Nigel Farage, all of these far right leaders all across Europe. Unless we can provide something compelling that is not based on racism or distrust of foreigners, I think those guys will win. But we're growing super quickly. I'm going to keep working. And if more people get behind the message, then I think we've got a chance.
Gary, you mentioned that Australia is a beautiful place to live, and we're very fortunate in some aspects, but that the housing crisis is becoming a massive issue here. It is incredibly unaffordable to even get in the market, and our rent is ridiculous. How would you go about, I guess, helping someone in that middle class get through this period? Like, what is the solution?
I mean, obviously, ordinary people in the middle class have to do what they can. I'm sure you'll give all the sensible advice. You need to study the right thing, get the best job, save as much as you can, try and avoid any excessive spending. But the truth is, nowadays, increasingly, both in your country and mine, housing is becoming an inherited asset. That's the truth of the matter. If you don't have parents who are able to give you that 100, 200,000 you need for a deposit, you are in a really, really difficult situation. That is simply the fact of the matter. I come from a poor family. I went to school with, smart kids. A lot of them did really well, went to good universities, got great jobs, making 2-3 times average income, and they can't buy a home. That's a messed up situation. But this is what happens when you compete ordinary people with billionaires. Listen, a billionaire can only live in 3, 4, 5 houses, but they can own 1,000. This is the big consequence of not keeping an eye on the wealth distribution. If these guys own more and more and more and more and more, then ordinary people own less and less and less and less and less. So I think we're in a bit of a situation where governments are trying to fix the problem with sticking plasters. They obviously they usually resort to things like making mortgages easier. And the end result is, you can buy a house, but you've got $1 million of debt. And I don't think it fixes the problem. Ultimately, I don't think you can fix this long term without dealing with growing inequality. I know housing is unaffordable there in Australia, and it's super unaffordable here. I'm talking to you from London. If you go and look at the really unequal parts of the world, go to Mumbai, go to Sao Paulo, go to Johannesburg, look at what housing costs compared to average wages there. And that was the same in the UK 100, 150 years ago. The truth is, very unequal countries are always countries of unaffordable housing, because you have a situation where ordinary people are competing with billionaires to own the homes. So I don't think you can fix this long term without dealing with that problem of growing inequality, which is why that's what I campaign for.
Yeah, I feel like the Australian government they're always saying, the way forward with this is build more houses. But it's like you said, the rich just keep buying those assets and making it incredibly unaffordable for the middle class to even get in the market. So I guess what you're suggesting is that we could essentially put a limit on what they can purchase, right?
Yeah, but even that, if you limit what the rich can purchase, but you don't limit their ability to accumulate assets, they can purchase in other ways.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, these are the guys that lend the mortgages. If I've got $1 million, and I could buy a house or rent it to my sister, or I could lend the money to my sister and she pays me interest. Mm-hmm. I could make a corporation and get the corporation to buy the homes. You're seeing a lot of that in the US. You're seeing it start to creep into the UK. So I think if you try to kind of skirt around the problem of rapidly, aggressively growing billionaire wealth by limiting what they can do, there's a lot, but without actually stopping them from accumulating wealth, the water is coming and you're trying to build a wall, but the water is still coming. And I know it's difficult, but at some point we do have to grasp the nettle of rapidly growing billionaire wealth. If we are going to exist in countries where the wealth share of the super rich grows rapidly, the obvious consequence of that is the wealth share of the rest has to shrink rapidly. Somebody has to look at that. You cannot have simultaneously a situation where the rich own everything and everyone else does not own nothing. It is, and I know it's difficult, and I know the rich have a lot of power in politics and a lot of power in media. But people have power as well. People have to use that power politically, and they have to say, listen, we're going to tax the rich because it is the only way to stop them from owning the houses that our kids need to start families in.
Gary, there'll be a lot of people watching this episode that have never worked in the finance industry or have any really understanding of it. Can you tell us about the time that you tried to leave and you were threatened?
Yeah, it's the opening scene in my book. So, I worked as a trader from 2008 to 2014. Super young, 21 when I started. I think I interned when I was 20. And I was very successful. I made a lot of money, especially in 2011. I was the top trader in the bank that year. And I made my money by basically understanding really exactly the things that we've spoken about on this podcast today, which is inequality is growing. That means asset prices are going to rise, living standards are going to fall, the economy will be weak. I made a lot of money betting on those things. And, you know, that was obviously like a bit of a trip because I come from a poor background and I was making my money by understanding that living standards would fall and fall and fall and fall and fall in the long term, which is like a disaster basically. So I decided to quit. At the time I decided to quit, I was one of Citibank's most profitable traders. So the opening scene of my book is me sort of being sat down by my boss in a ramen restaurant in Tokyo. And basically he said to me, you know, I can see what you're doing. It's a good thing. I think you're a good person, but sometimes bad things happen to good people. We can make life very difficult for you. And there was a strong implication that if I tried to leave, I'd be sued. But I'm out. I'm here now. I haven't been sued yet. Let's hope that continues for a lot longer.
I can imagine that you would have got a bit of pushback when you released that book. Did anyone come out of the woodworks that you used to work with?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, you search online, you'll see there's a kind of like bad guys in the book alliance that have like gone around and trying to sort of insist that I'm a liar and this kind of stuff, which is, to be honest, I think it's all part of the beauty of the book in a way. I mean, you write a book like this, which is kind of exposing the financial system, but also exposing the whole economy. You don't get any pushback. It means nobody read it. But I have to say as well, some of the guys have been like really cool about it. Like there's a guy in the book is called Spengler. He's not portrayed super positively in the book. One of my like colleagues as a trader, he messaged me on WhatsApp. He said, "Oh, you made me look like such a dick in the book." And I was kind of saying to him, "Oh, well, you know, we changed the name. It's kind of dramatized." And he just said to me, "Oh, but it's all true. So don't worry about it. Sorry for being such a dick," basically. So it's really funny to see the different ways that different people react.
Yeah.
Gary, one of the biggest episodes on the Diary of a CEO this year has been your episode with Daniel Priestley. It was a really, really interesting watch. I think it was 2.5, 3 hours.
Yeah.
It was really, really compelling viewing. It felt really balanced as well. Like you both got to have your say. But when you walked away from that experience, how did you feel? And because obviously it was quite heated at times.
Yeah, I mean, it was long. The shooting was 3.5 hours. And the set is it's quite funny, actually. I shoot in my kitchen, and people always say, like, "Oh, why are you shooting in a fake kitchen? There's no way that's a real kitchen." And it is my real kitchen. It's just there right now. And I would always thought, who would have a fake kitchen? But they actually shoot in like a whole fake reconstruction of Stephen Bartlett's apartment, which sort of blew my mind. It was long, 3.5 hours. It was quite intense. It was frustrating for me in a way because, you know, in a sense, it was a bit of a mismatch because I'm an economist and I was talking about the economy. And Daniel Priestley is a businessman who was talking about being a businessman. So obviously he's coming in it from the perspective of a businessman, which is what you need to do is do business, go out there, do business. And, you know, he's obviously made his business and it seems like it's quite a successful business and that's great for him. I'm coming in as an economist who has made my money understanding and betting on the structural collapse of our society. You know what I mean? And, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, we're on a plane that's crashing and one guy's like, well, actually, I'm an expert parachutist. So you guys all need to learn to be expert parachutists. You know, look, the economy is collapsing out here, you know, and if you are, you know, if you do have Daniel Priestley's skill set or my skill set, you know, I was like a super, super talented like mathematician and student. I was winning competitions as a kid, you know what I mean? And obviously I could go and do what Daniel does and say, hey, what you need to do is be a genius mathematician and be a genius trader. If I was selling books and courses online, how to be a genius trader, then they would probably sell a lot of books and I'd probably make a lot of money. But the truth is, I just don't think it works, you know, and, you know, I hope that Daniel Priestley does believe that works. But, you know, if it was as simple as buy Daniel Priestley's book, learn how to be a genius businessman, become a genius businessman, then we'd be in countries full of genius businessmen, right?
Yeah.
I think the problem is, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. If we're on the Titanic and Daniel Priestley is like an excellent cold water swimmer, maybe he doesn't care that we're going to hit the iceberg. But what about everybody else? What about the nurses? What about the postmen? What about the bus drivers? What about the school teachers? They can't all go and become millionaire entrepreneurs. And who protects them?
What are your thoughts on AI? And I mean, you talk about all of these different types of jobs, but do you have concerns that those jobs are going to be, redundant in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not an expert on AI. I think sometimes people overblow how amazing it's going to be. But I think it is already pretty obvious that it's going to replace a lot of jobs. I don't think it will replace all jobs, but I think it will replace a lot of jobs. But this is deeply related to inequality, right? Because AI, it should be a technology which massively increases productivity, which means we don't have to work so much, which means you'll have higher wages. One of my favourite economists from the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, British economist, he said our grandkids would only have to work, 10 hours a week. That's all they'll need to work because of the increase in productivity. But if machines become more productive, what happens if only a tiny group of people own all the machines? It's great for the guys that own the machines, but what about the rest of us? Again, it's AI could massively improve living standards, or it could massively decrease living standards. And it all depends on how we distribute the wealth and who owns the machines.
Yeah. Gary, I want to go back to taxing the rich. If we implemented this, I feel like there is a bit of a loophole because right now a lot of Australians who are quite wealthy are already leaving the country. We're seeing them move to Dubai, to Europe, or like Bali. They're all tax thresholds for them. What's the way around that? Like, if we start implementing these kinds of solutions and they just go to these other countries, it just doesn't seem fair.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's all about taxing wealth and not work. I've always said I'm not trying to raise tax on working people. Now, you raise tax on working people, we bring in a massive podcast tax. So you guys can go to Bali, you can go to Bali and you can do your job from Bali. But if you tax wealth, it's a lot more difficult. We had the situation here at the beginning of the Ukraine war. Here in London, there were a lot of Russian billionaires. The most famous was Roman Abramovich, who was connected to Putin. He owned Chelsea Football Club, which is one of the biggest football clubs in London. Suddenly, the government says you want to tax that. He's on the first plane to Moscow, and the government just freezes the asset. It's as simple as that. This wealth is your country's wealth. And in Australia, the situation is even more clear. A big chunk of Australia's wealth is natural resources, mineral resources under the ground. If these guys go, we're not talking about taxing working people. We're talking about taxing the billionaires who own your country. They own your natural resources. They own your property. They own your government debt. They own your mortgage debt. If I own $10 billion of Australian government debt and I live in Bali, where does my money come from? It comes from the Australian government. If I own $10 billion of Australian mineral wealth, where does my money come from? It comes from Australia. These people are taxable. These people are taxable because what they own is your country. And ultimately, the question which is at stake here is, do you want your country to be owned by people who live in and pay tax in your country? Or do you want your country to be owned by foreigners who don't contribute anything?
So what do you predict for Australia, the UK, over the next 24 months?
Well, living standards are falling here. Unfortunately, our government is not really getting to grips with wealth tax and inequality, but it has to be said that's not at all unique to the UK government. Living standards will unfortunately continue to fall. I think house prices could rise significantly as interest rates come down. Interest rates look like they will come down. 24 months is not a massive time in politics. I think we'll see, as always, the government which is in power will become aggressively unpopular because people expect living standards to not fall. And then that raises questions. Here in the UK, I think it's becoming increasingly clear, unless people like myself and other people pushing for lower inequality can generate a bigger political voice, it looks like Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the far-right Reform Party, will come into power. That will take 4 years. And I think the similar thing will happen all over Europe. It seems like Australia is a little bit behind with regards to growth of the far right, but you will get the same thing. The housing crisis will worsen, rent crisis will worsen, living standards will fall, you will continue to see this rapid increase in wealth of the rich and the super rich. The economy will centralize around them. And really, it's the same as it ever was, because that's been happening for 5 years, but it's been happening for 20 years. That's what's happening. You are seeing economies moving from being middle-class economies, which serve a large middle class, towards being very unequal economies, which serve a tiny elite. And the populations will continue to concentrate in big cities. Those big cities will continue to see housing be expensive. The centres will be populated by the kids of the very rich. You know, if you want to know the future for Australia and you want to know the future for England, go to Brazil, go to Mexico, go to India, go to Indonesia, because you can see what the future of a phenomenally unequal country looks like, because we have those phenomenally unequal countries in our world today. I don't want it to go there, but I think it will go there. And I think politics will increasingly move to the far right. But it's a job of people like me, and you know, I would like the support of people like you to make the point to the public that there are alternatives. It doesn't just have to be the far right. We can deal with billionaires. We can distribute wealth more fairly. And that means getting wealth back into the hands of ordinary working Australians.
Let's say there was a 16-year-old listening to this right now or watching this, and they're a little concerned. They're hearing all of this. They're finishing school. How would you explain money to that person if they ask you the question, what is money, and how does it work?
Yeah, money is a score sheet at the end of the day. Money is a score sheet. Money is not the real resource. What really matters is your ability to get real resources. But both money and real resources are becoming very unequally distributed. What I would say to a young person is, first of all, I know you've been given a bum deal here. It was much easier to be born 20, 30 years before they were born. But you don't get to choose. You don't get to choose whether you live in hard times or easy times. I think one of the most difficult things for young people today is they increasingly live in these very unequal economies where financial outcomes for individuals are more and more connected to basically what family you came from. Which is how things were, say, 100 years ago. But they live in this kind of cultural idea of meritocracy. So I think young people are in this really difficult situation nowadays where they're playing a very unfair game that is rigged against them, and they're told that the outcomes are fair. And I think I think we do a real disservice to the young people. I think we need to tell them the truth, which is, listen, the economy has become very unequal now. If you come from a poor family, your life will be a struggle. That doesn't mean you don't work hard. That doesn't mean you don't push yourself. That doesn't mean you don't try to get the good job, to make money, to buy a house, to get financial security for your children. You have to do that. Anyone would do that. I did that. Everybody does that. But we need to tell them the honest truth, which is, realistically, we are moving in towards kind of feudalistic, aristocratic, inherited societies. It's very, very difficult to move up from where you came from. Work hard. If you come from a poor background and you're able to make the money you need to support a family, you should be really, really, really proud of yourself, because we're making that harder and harder and harder. And if you are able to get that financial security, or even in a better case, maybe get yourself to a situation where you are doing well and you've got a little bit extra and you have a little bit more space, a little bit more time. If you have that energy, come back and help us fight for a fairer future. Because if we don't take action here, inequality will get worse and worse and worse and worse. And listen, you and I, we're both in fortunate situations. We live in countries with good living standards, with a strong middle class. We will lose that. I don't want to live in a country where the rich live surrounded by barbed wire. I don't want to be on either side of that, okay? So listen, work hard, make your money, do what you need to do for you and your family. But once you get that security, help us fight for the future of our countries.
Gary, do you think the education system is broken?
I think it's very broken. So I went to a grammar school, which is like a good free school. I got expelled from that school. I went to like the local school. Then I went to the London School of Economics, which is like an extremely prestigious economics school here in London. More recently, I did a master's in Oxford. I worked in the city, which is like a very prestigious job. And what I saw was, I worked in Canary Wharf, which is here in East London. So I'm from East London, traditionally the poorest part of London. I come from a very poor family. Somebody came up to me once and they said, "Oh, that's an interesting accent. Where are you from?" And it was like there in the middle of East London. And the truth is, nowadays, very, very, very few people from poor or ordinary backgrounds are able to get into those jobs. And I think it's a crying shame. And that is partly because the education system is broken. I remember when I was at LSE, the way to get a good job was to get an internship in your second year. But, my whole plan was, I'm really good at maths. I'm going to get the best maths grades and I'm going to get a job like that. But the jobs are given out in second year, which is before you get your grades, right? Which massively benefits rich people from rich families who have all this crazy stuff on their CV. I mean, who has a good CV when you're 19? The only people who have a good CV at 19 are people from rich families. I think we have a really broken system, which is not getting the best kids into the best jobs. It's unfortunately getting the richest kids into the best jobs most of the time.
Gary, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do any of this that you're doing. So what's going on inside you? Like, what is fueling you to keep showing up and keep doing this?
I just don't want things to be shit. It's just, I was never, I wasn't that kid in the school politics society. I was just wanted to make money. But listen, I was great at maths and I was good at economics and I became interested in economics and it was my job to be good at economics. And I realized that if we don't take action, things will get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And that's real. I come from a poor childhood and I know what it's like to be poor. I know what it's like to not know that you're going to have security in your future, if you can ever buy a house, to not know if you'll ever be able to take care of a family. I know that feeling. And I don't want the future to be like that. And, I'm a very fortunate person. I'm financially secure. I don't need to work. And I made my money by understanding that the economy will be worse forever. Like for me, honestly, I view what I do. You're walking down the street and you see there's a house on fire. What do? You call the fire brigade and you knock on the doors and you throw stones at the windows and you try and make sure there's nobody in there. It's as simple as that. That was my job. My job was to sit here and understand big global economies, how they're going to go, their future. And I was extremely successful at that. I was one of the best in the world at that. I made a ton of money doing it because I understood it's going to get worse. So for me, I know it's not as immediate as a house is on fire, but in my professional life, that's what I saw. And that's what I see. I see economies that are on fire that are going to get worse. And, you read my book, the story's all in my book. Like I fell into a depression and it kind of gave me a kind of crisis of meaning and understanding in my life. But really, for me, it comes down to something as simple as that, which is, if you see a disaster that is going to happen, and like me, you're in a privileged position where you have the time and you have the space to do something about it, and you're an expert on it, I think that's what you should do. And it doesn't mean that I don't want to make money and I don't want to have a good life. I want all those things, but I think it's important that we as humans try to protect the societies that we live in. If we don't, then they will fall apart.
Gary, we like to end our episodes with our guests showing us an item that they have either around them or something that's important to them. Is there an item that you'd like to show us today?
What have I got around me? You know what? I was last month I went to Japan. Mm-hmm. So I used to live in Japan. Japan was a really important place for me. It was kind of where I learned a lot and I learned the language. And I went there last month and they gave me, this is the Japanese translation of my book. Can you see that?
Oh, that's so cool.
I'm trying to read it, trying to get through. But honestly, this is a bit cheesy and people think I'm probably going to try and pitch my book. This is probably not specific to the Japanese version. I've got the English version here. The thing I'm most proud of. There you go. That's the English version. For sale in all your good bookstores. That's the story of the story I just told you, which was me going from being a kid that just wanted to make money to seeing the system is broken and perhaps starting to raise the questions of maybe we should do something about it. And it's kind of the genesis, the start of the work that I do. But also it's just something I'm phenomenally proud of. And it's given me this massive reach all over the world. It's given me, I see the numbers on YouTube. So obviously I know we've got tons of viewers in Australia. That's amazing. I worked with Australians. There's those Australians in London. I'm from a part of England known as Essex. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
And I've always thought of Australia as basically a really big sunny Essex. So for me, it's a place that I'm really glad to see we've got a lot of support there. And I'm actually planning to come, I think it's Feb or March next year, to do a little tour.
Awesome.
Well, let's have a beer when you're down here. We'd love to catch up with you.
Yeah, definitely. Where are you guys based?
We're in Sydney.
Oh, I'll definitely come.
Yeah, we'd love to see it.
That'd be awesome.
If someone's made it this far into the episode, Gary, is there anything you want to say to that person that has made it all the way through?
Yeah, I would like to say, listen, I know the message that I send is sometimes a bit depressing because I can paint quite a bleak picture of the future. But listen, what I want to say is, look, we've come from worse places than this and we fixed it. 100 years ago, here in my country, there was desperate poverty for ordinary people. My grandma, she was from London, early 20th century. 3 of her siblings died of tuberculosis, in the richest country in the world. Terrible poverty, terrible inequality. And then just 50 years later, the welfare state, housing, healthcare, education, food, they fought for that and they got it. So listen, I know, especially for younger people, I know you've been dealt a bum hand and you're living in a difficult world. But you don't get to choose the times you live in. And people have fought hard from worse places and they've got to better things. So listen, take a big breath in, a big breath out. Stick with it. Do what you can. Make your money. Support your family. But come back and help us fight this fight. And we can fix this problem. We can.
Gary Stevenson, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.